there's so many questions because it felt like once we got this judge's ruling over in Florida, we kind of went from masks to maybe no masks overnight.
Yeah.
In some places.
In some places, in some jurisdictions, on some transit agencies. But just to kind of walk back and kind of just see the action that we saw yesterday, the airlines dropped the mask mandates for domestic flights. Again, because of that, as you mentioned, the federal judge in Florida avoiding that CDC requirement. The Transportation Security Administration is not enforcing it. Again, there's a lot of players here. But the end has kind of led to something of a scramble among, let's say, for example, Uber and Amtrak. They have dropped the mask requirement, but then the MTA on the subway here in New York City still enforcing it. So as you mentioned, this is just all over the place. And for people that are trying to get onto public transit, you might be confused as to what the lay of the land is right now.
Well, and you mentioned MTA here in New York, but New Jersey Transit is dropping the mask mandate. I mean, that pretty
Originally
much
they didn't, and then they did.
Didn't, and then they did.
Right.
And that really kind of speaks to, I think, a lot of the confusion that's likely to follow as a result. Interesting to see, though, today the airlines soaring in that big way because, you know, many of these airlines have been pushing for this mask mandate to be dropped. I have to say, I took a flight a few weeks ago. Everybody was still wearing a mask. It felt less contentious. But if you look at the stock moves here, I mean, that seems to point to the fact that people are going to feel a little more comfortable traveling again, even without the masks in place.
And important to note that some of this might be the drift ahead of earnings season as well. United obviously set to report soon. But, you know, broadly speaking, this is a story that regardless of whether or not you're a shareholder, you're interested in. I'm going to be flying on United tomorrow. I'm very interested to see what Newark Airport is going to look like. But for me personally, Akiko, I'm planning on still wearing that mask. And I respect everyone's decision now that this is not a requirement any longer. People can choose if they do or don't want to. For me personally, I just know I tend to get sick after I fly. I mean, you're in a steel tube in the sky. I think that we actually had a Twitter reaction online that we caught that said, look, at the end of the day, it's just kind of a dirty place to be. So maybe it's good to just keep that mask on. Outside of COVID, it's just getting a cold or maybe other types of, bronchitis if people get sick. Because, look, during the pandemic, people were able to cancel their fares, right, or at least change a flight. Yep. You can't do that anymore. A lot of people, you know what, if I've got a fever, I'm going to fly anyway. Very different than at a restaurant. If you're sick, you're probably going to cancel that reservation.
And it feels like it kind of comes down to people's comfort level. Because at this point, I mean, I'm saying this point, but you feel like all along it's been a bit fragmented. Right. But, you know, it's worth noting that all of these, the mask mandate largely being dropped right now at a time when we are starting to see those case counts go up again. I was looking at the numbers this morning. The case counts up about 40% over the last 14 days. But the fact that this is happening really points to the fact that this is kind of the new normal. We're treating COVID increasingly like the flu, it feels. And we'll just kind of see the case counts go up, but still.
And this is the balance, is that people still need to go out and live their lives. That's been happening since the end of 2020. But again, everyone's got thoughts on this. And again, New York City, where subway riders will still, at least for now, be required to keep their mask on. We got some reaction from them as the CDC travel mask order is eliminated. Take a listen to what they said.
I think it's going to be a partisan issue for forever, just because it's people's bodies and their safety and their mental health and well-being. So I think it's going to vary from person to person.
I just feel like mask mandates are coming down too quickly. People at my school are getting it like every day.
Usually I don't got no mask right now, so that's cool with me.
That's their prerogative. If they don't want to wear it, they don't have to wear it, but I'm going to keep wearing it.
And again, we've been seeing a number of other types of companies come out with their own statements and their own stances in the aftermath of that scramble yesterday. So Lyft, as is reported by The Hill, now apparently lifting their requirement for masks as well. Let's bring in Yahoo Finance's Anjali Khemlani, who's been watching this story very closely. And Anjali, semantics matter. Interesting to note that the airlines, all the major airlines, in the hours after the announcement of that federal ruling in Florida, essentially lifted it. What are you hearing from them?
They did drop it. And then not only did that happen, but then also there was confusion because in the airports, they were still mandated or required. And it just seems like a very confusing situation. And Delta specifically facing some backlash over the way that they phrased their initial statement. They basically called COVID-19 a quote unquote ordinary seasonal virus. And that really spurred some backlash among health experts and officials. But they have since changed it. A new statement out about 60 minutes ago saying, please be patient. patient. There's lots of confusion. You're going to face different rules and requirements when you're in an airport or on a plane, and just be patient. Everyone is trying to implement this, as is. And this is a chaos that really is going to continue to be faced, because we know, like you guys pointed out, that the transit systems in regional transit systems are going to behave differently. Uber and Lyft acting differently as well. It's just going to be very confusing for individuals, and you're just basically on your own.
Well, in many ways, it kind of comes down to everybody's comfort level at this point. And I've noticed just walking around the city, sometimes you get in an elevator with somebody, you're wearing a mask, and that person says, oh, do you want me to put on a mask too? I mean, we're sort of at this awkward phase. But it's a different story with what's playing out over in China. We've been talking about this so much because the measures that have been put in place are so incredibly draconian, and it makes you wonder how much longer they can continue this zero COVID policy.
Well, and that's the issue, is that they're facing an entirely different type of virus right now compared to what was in Wuhan in 2020 when the pandemic first began. So if you look at what's happened since then, right, they're facing not just a more transmissible virus, but they're also facing struggles to kind of control it and using all these measures, like you said, which have been causing all sorts of problems like food and medical supply shortages as well.
I mean, to what extent is this about not having the public vaccinated to the extent that, for example, the U.S. has? They've also had a policy in place where younger people get vaccinated first. And in many ways, that was seen as protecting the older population.
A lot farther from herd immunity, essentially, yeah.
Right, and you had the hesitancy. They were trying to overcome that hesitancy as well from the older generation. So now what you're seeing is, because we now know that COVID affects older people more, and they're more likely to die from the virus. That's where they're struggling to kind of come back to a point where they have, because it's not like we don't have that problem too. We also have struggles with the vaccination, but we have a different issue where more older individuals are vaccinated, at least in this country, for sure.